called Baha Musa, who was killed by British troops very early on in the occupation of Iraq. But more recently, this year, they presented a dossier to the International Criminal Court. What that dossier says in 250 pages, it gives a whole catalogue of crimes alleged against British troops and British officials, including mock executions, sexual assault, electrocution, beatings, and all sorts of other forms of torture and abuse. And it specifically names the former Defence Secretary, a man called Jeff Hoon, the former Defence Minister, a man called Adam Ingram, and these were the people directly responsible for the troops, as opposed to the decision to go to war, and the former head of the British Army, Sir Peter Wall. So these are cases which are being brought against some of the highest officials in the United Kingdom. There are two other aspects of the legal holding to account of Tony Blair that I want to stress. The first is the campaign to make a citizen's arrest against Tony Blair. I don't know if people are familiar with this concept in law, but in English common law you have the right, if you think somebody has committed a crime, you have the right, even if you are not a policeman or a legal official, you have the right to try to arrest those people if you see that they've been stealing or anything like that. A journalist launched a campaign called Arrest Blair, which asked people, if they saw Blair wandering around, to make a citizen's arrest against him. And so far, 5 people have attempted to do this. They've all done it, obviously very, very spontaneously, because they don't mix in Blair's circles most of the time, but they've kind of come across him, and they've seen him, gone and put a hand on his shoulder and said, there's a particular form of words, I'd like to arrest you for crimes against humanity and so on. The latest one was a young man who worked as a waiter in a restaurant in the City of London, a very expensive restaurant. And he described how he saw Blair sitting at dinner with his sons and bodyguards, and he said, I didn't like the job anyway very much, and I knew once I did it I wouldn't have a job at the end of it. So he went up, put his hand on his shoulder and said, I'd like to arrest you and all this. Tony Blair said, aren't you concerned about the war in Syria? Don't you realise, that we should have an intervention in Syria? So this guy, whose name was Ziggy, said, no, I want to arrest you. He only gave up when the police were called, and that's when he left his job and left the restaurant before he ended up in prison himself. But this made headline news, and in every one case, the journalist has awarded a small amount of money to the people who've done it as a bounty, as a kind of reward. And they've been very, very popular, and a number of them have come and spoken on demonstrations and done all those kind of things. However, we probably all agree that it's going to take more than one right-minded citizen to arrest Blair, given the circumstances. And perhaps lots of people have thought they might achieve something through the various inquiries that have taken place about the Iraq War. There have now been 3 official inquiries in the United Kingdom. Anybody who knows about British official inquiries might know that they're not really a means to find out the truth, but to prevent the truth from being found out is really the way that they work. And they're usually conducted by very reliable judges and people like that. Indeed, when 13 people were shot by British troops in Northern Ireland, it took 38 years before they could get a proper inquiry. So we're not really holding out much hope. But the Chilcot inquiry is by far, the most recent one, is by far the most wide-ranging. And the centre of Chilcot is very much on the legal advice that he was given. Was the legal advice changed? Who changed it? Were they put under pressure by the Prime Minister and by various other ministers to do so? Now, it won't be a big surprise for you to know that although it stopped taking evidence 3 years ago, it still hasn't reported. The reason it hasn't reported is that George Bush and Tony Blair are blocking the evidence from being made public. And the United States is saying this is not in their national interest for the evidence to be made public. Now, you might have thought this would be something the British government would have considered when they set up the tribunal in the first place. And we were told that it was going to report by Easter 2014. Well, as this weekend is Easter 2014. We're fairly confident it's not going to be reported on by then. In fact, this week, the Deputy Prime Minister attacked Blair over Iraq. Blair's response was he has nothing to hide, and anyway, it was totally wrong not to attack Syria last August. That's his response to the let's have more wars, not less. And now they're saying that Chilcot may not report until 2015. Now, given that there is an election in Britain in May 2015, this will mean they will delay it until after an election. Now, we are doing everything that we can to make sure this doesn't happen. We want it to be published. However weak it is, we think it will be an indictment of Blair to a certain extent, and it's very, very important that it does come out into the open. But we're not confident that anything other than relentless campaigning by people on a legal basis, on a political basis, and on an activist basis is going to really bring Blair, or indeed Bush, to account over any of these issues. So just to conclude, to say this, the overall picture is this: the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which is now supposedly coming to an end, but has all of the faults that we've talked about all day over the war in Iraq. Both of these wars and the intervention in Libya and continued covert intervention in Syria and the threat of war in Ukraine, which people find very, very frightening, all of these are casting a very long shadow over British politics. We believe that as a country which has a very long and not a very honourable imperial past in terms of its role in wars and so on, we believe it is extremely important that in Britain we do strengthen anti-war opinion, we do try to support all these attempts to bring Blair to account. I think we've succeeded in ruining his reputation. Well, he probably did that for himself. We probably didn't have to help him very much. They always say history will judge these things, but I think history already has judged the Iraq War and has found it a war which was totally unjustified and totally unnecessary. We will continue to campaign, and just to bring in one final way of thinking about this, in the United Kingdom, as indeed in France, in Belgium, in many parts of Europe, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the beginning of a war which was supposed to end all wars, the First World War, which had terrible consequences for millions and millions of people. Our government is using the anniversary of that war to try to justify present wars and to allow them to go to future wars. So we also have a campaign to say we want to remember the dead of the First World War, but we want to do it in a way which does not glorify war and which says, far from continuing to have wars, the 100th anniversary since the First World War should mark the end of all wars. So thank you very much.
So we have three